to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a really fascinating thematic journey. We're going to go from these highly localized historical conflicts straight into some of the most profound cosmic truths about pride, divine justice, and the literal crash of ancient superpowers. Let's dive right in.
Hello everyone, this is TN Inside. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from the book of Ezekiel, chapters 25 through 28. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, judgment on neighboring nations. Second, the fall of mighty Tyre. Third, a sinking ship of wealth. Fourth, the arrogant king. And finally, Israel's restoration and peace.
Okay, let's jump straight into section 1, Judgment on Neighboring Nations, Ezekiel chapter 25.
So, the text kicks off by mapping out how the specific sins, and really the petty schadenfreude, of 4 neighboring nations resulted in some highly targeted judgments. Take Ammon, for instance. The narrative describes them literally clapping their hands and cheering when Judah was taken captive. The result? They're handed over to the people of the east. Then you've got Moab and Seir, who casually claim Judah was just like any other nation. Edom went out of their way to seek bitter vengeance. And Philistia? Well, they harbored this deep, long-standing hostility. In the text, you see this direct cause and effect. Every single action meets a very specific divine consequence. Now, what's the underlying theological premise here? It's the idea that God's authority and justice absolutely aren't just confined to Israel. They extend over the entire globe. The text makes the case that because God is holy, every single nation is held to that exact same standard.
Moving on to section 2, the fall of mighty Tyre, Ezekiel chapter 26.
Okay, scaling up the narrative, the text shifts to the grand systemic pride of the ultimate ancient maritime superpower, Tyre, and the source outlines this staggering historical timeline. First up, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon starts this grueling 13-year siege against Tyre's mainland. Eventually, decades later, the people of Tyre actually retreat to their rocky island fortress, basically thinking, hey, we're perfectly safe out here. But then, get this, 2.5 centuries later, Alexander the Great comes along. He literally builds a massive causeway, 800 meters long, filling the sea with stones and dirt just to march his army across and completely conquer them. It's wild to see how that unfolded over hundreds of years. The severity of this destruction in the narrative really can't be overstated. Tyre was once the untouchable ruler of the seas, right? But the text states it would sink into the deep, becoming an entity no one could even find anymore. It deeply connects this striking visual of a sinking island city to the ultimate ancient symbol of divine cleansing, which is, of course, the flood of Noah's time. Let's look at section 3, a sinking ship of wealth. Ezekiel chapter 27. This staggering list vividly paints a picture of Tyre's absolute economic dominance right before they crashed. I mean, they were building these mighty ships with premium Lebanon cedar and Bashan oak. They were hiring foreign mercenaries all the way from Persia and Libya just to fight for there. They traded globally with ancient regions like Java and Tubal for slaves and bronze. Even Judah and Israel were bringing wheat, honey, and oil to their markets. They were accumulating the absolute finest spices, gems, and gold from merchants worldwide. They were, without a doubt, the undisputed center of the global economy. But then comes the lament. And a lament is simply an expression of deep sorrow. In this narrative, the sinking ship is a metaphor for the total catastrophic crash of a worldwide economic hub. Basically, on the day of Tyre's downfall, all its wealth, its goods, the traders, the sailors, they all metaphorically sink into the sea. The nations that got incredibly rich off this trade wept bitterly over the sudden collapse, while other global merchants kind of mocked its demise. The ultimate symbol of earthly security just vanished beneath the waves. Which brings us to section 4, the arrogant king, Ezekiel chapter 28. In chapter 28, the text depicts God speaking directly to the leaders of Tyre, and it hits on the absolute core issue. They are arrogant and think of themselves as gods, sitting in the place of God. You see, they allowed their outstanding wisdom and immense wealth to twist into this ultimate unchecked arrogance. The narrative is reminding them quite bluntly, look, you aren't divine. You are merely mortals who are about to be conquered by ruthless nations. Now, what's really interesting here is how the text brilliantly bridges from a literal human king into this profound cosmic metaphor, basically narrating the birth and downfall of Satan. Just look at the original state, described as a model of perfection, utterly beautiful, appointed as a guardian cherub, a divine being, right in the Garden of Eden. But then, as trade flourished and power grew, this figure's heart was entirely corrupted by his own splendor and pride. Resorting to violence and deceit, he was cast out from the holy mountain. It's an incredibly powerful narrative picture of how unchecked pride can destroy even the most magnificent creations.
Finally, Section 5, Israel's Restoration and Peace, Ezekiel chapter 28.
Despite all the heavy destruction we just covered in the previous chapters, the narrative completely shifts gears to emphasize that God remains faithful to his covenant. He promises to actually gather the captive Israelites who were scattered all over and bring them back to dwell in the land promised to Jacob. For the original readers, this was a profound source of comfort, reassuring them that ultimate peace and security were still going to be preserved for them. So the source material here is really illustrating a dual nature of God's holiness. Step 1 is strict justice, revealing his holiness by not tolerating sin and by actively punishing these arrogant, boastful nations. But operating right alongside that is step 2, deep compassion. The text portrays a God who forgives and restores his repentant people. It shows us how true justice and beautiful compassion can operate perfectly side by side. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've just walked through a narrative where the grandest, wealthiest, and most arrogant earthly powers can literally sink in an instant. And that's juxtaposed right next to a promise to lovingly restore the broken. So the question the text leaves us with is this: how do we recognize these ancient themes of unchecked pride and the deep need for restoration in our own modern world today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.